Hi, welcome back. In this session, we're going to talk about a bedrock issue in both corporate finance and valuation, which is whose interests come first when a corporation makes decisions. Let's step back first and look at some history. For the last few decades, the central objective for corporations has been that shareholders are primary. Their interests come first, and the interests of other stakeholders are not ignored, but they're viewed more as constraints. In the last week, though, the Business Roundtable, which is made up of CEOs of some of America's largest companies, put out a press release that has, in a sense, shaken the question of whether this is in fact the primary objective. They've used the word stakeholder, which is a loaded word, and the way the press release reads, it's almost as if it's an argument for stakeholder wealth maximization. The question you might ask is, who cares? What's the difference? You're going to see it's going to make a huge difference in how companies make decisions. As I go through this session, though, I have to confess that it's personal for me. There are two classes I teach: a corporate finance class, which is about how companies, how businesses should make decisions, and there, the objective of the company, the shareholder maximization, the wealth maximization objective, drives how companies make choices. And the other class, of course, that I teach is valuation. It's about measuring that value. So to me, the question of whether this is in fact the right objective is going to change the way I think about the topic and how I teach it. So let's look at what the Business Roundtable sent out as a message, and then look at the messenger, and then take a look at what exactly it might mean for the rest of us. Now, the Business Roundtable is composed of CEOs of some of America's largest companies. Usually when they get together every year and they release a statement, nobody really cares because it's typical CEO speak. It means absolutely nothing. It's pablum, it's PR more than something substantial. But this year was different, and both journalists and politicians took notice. Rather than paraphrase what the Business Roundtable said, I'm going to actually read directly from their statement. So here's what it says. While each of our individual companies serves its own corporate purposes, we share a fundamental commitment to all of our stakeholders. We commit to delivering value to our customers, investing in our employees, dealing fairly and ethically with our suppliers, supporting the communities in which we work, and generating long-term value for shareholders. You're saying, what's the big deal? It sounds like pretty normal stuff. What set the statement apart was the use of the word stakeholder, which is a word that's been used by people who pushed against shareholder wealth maximization as an objective for a long time, and the listing of what companies were supposed to do for each stakeholder, and at least from the look of it, making it look like all of these objectives were equally good objectives. In other words, none of these objectives were set above the rest. Customers matter, employees matter, shareholders matter. And of course, journalists caught on, and for the next few days, you probably saw the articles that I did, which is about maybe this is a revolutionary change in how companies are going to be run. Now, before we go down that path, the message was delivered by Jamie Dimon. I mean, out of the 181 CEOs, why they picked Jamie Dimon, I don't know, because Jamie Dimon is a very good banker. In fact, he's an even better politician, and that's actually a good combination to have as a CEO of a money center bank. But he's definitely not somebody I would think of as an advocate for shareholders. In fact, for the last few years, Jamie and his shareholders have been fighting it out over shareholder compensation, and one of the first issues that triggered the clashes was Jamie Dimon making himself chairman of the board of directors that actually is supposed to take to have oversight over him, something that's never made sense to me. But over the last 5 or 6 years, this has been a theme at every JP Morgan meeting where shareholders have repeatedly voted against both Jamie Dimon being chairman and his compensation contracts. He's usually won these fights because it's very difficult to win a fight in an annual meeting because most shareholders don't show up. But the very fact that he's been fighting with shareholders makes him not that much of a shareholder advocate. In fact, when Jamie Dimon talks about shareholder wealth maximization and acts like this is what he's been focusing on over the last 15 years that he's been CEO of JP Morgan, he's got about as much credibility as Madonna singing like a virgin, or Kim Kardashian talking about the importance of privacy. I mean, he's really never cared about shareholders as the primary stakeholders in the company. But that's a different issue. So the message from these CEOs seems to be, hey, we care about all stakeholders, maybe not equally, but they're all up there. And the messenger is not exactly the person who should be talking about, hey, we don't care about shareholders, because you've never cared about shareholders in the first place. Now, before we look at what exactly this might mean for us, let's take a look at why you need an objective for a corporation. I mean, when you don't have, the way I describe this in my class, if you don't know where you're going, it doesn't matter how you get there. So to think about how companies make decisions, you first have to specify what the end game is. What are you trying to do as a company? And maximizing shareholder wealth has been a very effective focusing objective because it drives how companies then make investments, fund those investments, and determine how much cash they return to shareholders. So this notion that shareholders are first among a group of stakeholders has driven decision making. It's also the basis for how performance has been evaluated and compensation has been set for CEOs. By making shareholders the center of the game, the CEOs who deliver more value for their shareholders were therefore rewarded more and essentially had a greater chance of continuing as CEOs. But that's why objectives matter, because if you change the end game, then obviously the way decisions get made will change. The way we evaluate CEOs and compensate them will also change. So let's start by looking at all of the different stakeholders in a public company. Who are these stakeholders that people talk about when they talk about stakeholder wealth maximization? First, remember that in the modern corporation, stockholders are not the ones making day-to-day decisions. It's not practical. So stockholders hire managers. Managers make the investment, the financing, and the dividend decision. Shareholders supply equity capital, and they try to oversee managers either through a board of directors, which in theory is supposed to work for the shareholders, or through the annual meeting. There are, of course, the other source of capital, which comes from bondholders and banks. They lend money, and then they exercise some power as well through covenants and sometimes veto power over decision making. But that's not all. There are other players in this game. There are employees in the company. The employees in the company negotiate with the company either through unions or directly to get wages and benefits, and in return for providing services providing their employment to the company. And the companies themselves operate in sectors of businesses where they have competitors, and the name in any competitive marketplace is for you to take market share away from your competitors. But there are rules that guide how you do it. And then, of course, there are two other very important groups. One is customers who have to buy or sell your product. And through the mix of product and price, companies try to attract customers to them. And there's, of course, society. That's always around. Because companies in the process of making decisions create side costs for society. And you can think of some big ones: environmental costs, the traffic, the pollution, basically the whole list of them, side costs, and sometimes side benefits for society. So there's society, their customers, their employees, their lenders, their shareholders, and competitors. And the problem, of course, is these groups often have very different interests. What's good for one group will not be good for another. So trying to keep every group happy is impossible. You have to make some choices. So let's look at different versions of corporatism and how those choices are made. Now, if you go back to the late 1800s, the early part of the 20th century, you had companies that followed what you can call cutthroat corporatism. Many of these companies were run by their founder family as CEOs, and these were powerful people, and they're legendary. Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller. I mean, they were not, the word that comes to mind when you think about these companies, they were ruthless on every dimension. The end game here was to increase the wealth of the founder, and because there were other shareholders in the company, they were often went along for the ride, but the focus was the founders tried to make themselves more wealthy and more powerful. Banks and bondholders often were also controlled by these same founders, so they tended not to tie the hands of the founders too much. The objective of these companies was to drive the competition out of the game and make themselves monopolies. Remember, both U.S. Steel and Standard Oil, the end game was they wanted to monopolize the business. Employees were there to be exploited. I mean, there's no way around it. These robber barons did not take kindly to unions. They tried to pay the least they could and get the most work they could get in return. And as far as customers in society were concerned, customers were there to be exploited as well. In effect, what you tried to do as a company was to make yourself the only choice and then charge the highest price you could to deliver the least product you could to customers. And if in the process you create social costs, you really didn't care. In fact, you didn't even care if there were laws restricting you. You felt free to break the laws. So cutthroat corporatism basically is Darwinian rules brought into competition, where companies essentially go all out. It's all about winning all the time. So the winners in this game would tended to be the ones that had the most power to the most. So in a sense, the most powerful ended up dominating the game, winning the game, and often being the only players in the game. Now you're saying, well, that was in the 1800s and the early 1900s, and it's true, they did attract a backlash. Teddy Roosevelt, the antitrust laws were written to stop them. But that doesn't mean they've completely gone away. I mean, every generation, we have companies we point to and say, those companies are ruthless, they're cutthroat competitive. And in fact, I've heard it used with Uber in recent years as to how they drove their status quo. In fact, the essence of many of these disruptive companies seems to be to take the status quo essentially to the mat and drive them up. So that's cutthroat corporatism. Let's move on to a second version of corporatism, where the end game is still the same. You want to build a company that ends up dominating, but the way you do it is slightly different. Rather than do it through efficiency or a better product or product differentiation, Crony corporatism is built around getting the governments and rule riders to tilt the playing field in your favor. How do you do it? You either corrupt them or you co-opt them, and in a sense, the government then becomes your partner in this process. It puts its thumb on the scale and allows you to win the game. So what these companies do is managers essentially try to increase the value of these companies, and the game is fixed. So they drive the competition out because the government works as, helps the company drive the competition out. Often, even with employees, the government ends up being on the side of the company versus the employees. If there are social costs created, the government writes rules that allows you to do it. And finally, because customers have no choice again, they have to buy the products and services provided by Crony Corporate. So in this game, the winner is not, just as in the cutthroat, there's often a few winners. But the winners are not the most efficient companies, they're the most connected companies. So in a sense, you can argue that crony corporatism, you get all the costs of cutthroat corporatism, which is you end up with monopolies and none of the benefits. It's not even the most efficient companies that did it. Of course, it's easy to point your finger at Asian and Latin American family group companies. Hey, they're crony corporatists, or the Chinese, and say, you know what, Beijing is always putting its finger, and there's an element of truth to it. But the reality is there is an element of cronyism, and even in developed markets, there are some who argue that the lobbying that U.S. companies do essentially creates an element of cronyism, and I concede that there is but that's the second version of corporatism. There's a third version of corporatism that developed, especially in the U.S. in the aftermath of the Second World War. I call this managerial corporatism. These are companies where there is separation between stockholders and managers. What does that mean? Well, the founders, the families that created these companies have moved on. They're professional managers. The shareholders in this company now are splintered. None of them have the power or the interest in trying to change the way it's run. So essentially, so what happens is boards of directors of these companies become essentially rubber stamps for CEOs, and annual meetings are just basically scripted affairs where nothing happens. Lenders often, because they know the managers of the companies, they know that they're going to be there for the long term, tend not to rock the boat. as far as employees and the sector is concerned, this is with managerial corporatism. Essentially, the objective of the manager is to make his or her life as easy as possible. So some of that comes from trying to enrich themselves, but some of it just means, hey, I don't want to create trouble, friction that's going to take away more of my time. So they'll often co-opt every group. Employees are co-opted often by offering them a decent package of wages and benefits, where they're told, look, if you want this package to continue, don't make waves. The same thing with the sector. No company aggressively drives out the other, because that creates all kinds of consequences. So you have this steady state where you have multiple companies that continue to let the other companies stay in, and so you have duopolies. 3 companies, 4, but essentially there's more spreading of market power. Customers get a decent product or service for the. In other words, in this system, it's all about if your interests as a stakeholder are converge with managerial interests, you're lucky. You're going to get what you want. If they diverge, God help you, managers are going to put their interests first. So this is managerial corporatism. The winners here tend to be these long tenure companies that have been around a long time, with CEOs who stay on for long periods. And the rest of the stakeholders may or may not benefit, depending on whether their interests converge with those of managers. The reason this works so well in the US after the late 40s, in fact, it coincided with a period of economic prosperity, and people, employees had decent wages, and people tend to forget the social costs of benefits, but they're viewed as a period of benign relationships between companies and society. The reason it worked, though, was post-World War II. The US was the global economy, and US companies had an incredible amount of slack in their business models. What do I mean by slack? They were able to make enough money that they could keep all this. They were, in a sense, paying off the stakeholders so that managers could continue to run the company. And it's no coincidence that this system started to come under pressure in the late 70s and the early 80s, when the slack started to disappear. US companies were no longer the center of the universe. Competition was starting to pick up. So these companies were continuing to be run by managers in their interests, but now those interests were eating into what was happening to shareholders, employees. So you started to see pushback, especially from activist shareholders, which gave rise to what I call constrained corporatism, which is basically what most companies have operated under for the last 30 years. In constrained corporatism, you're returning to maximizing shareholder wealth, but there are constraints that you impose on your relationships. So every other stakeholder has some kind of relationship, legal or otherwise, with the company, and the relationship has constraints. So with shareholders, the constraints might be board of directors might put some pressure on CEOs if they don't do their job. Annual meetings, activist investors can create proxy fights. So the constraint here is, to the extent that you get pushback, you can't overreach with shareholders. With lenders, if there are again restrictions they put on you, and if you violate those restrictions, the restrictions get tighter. With employees, you try to negotiate as an employer a decent wage, but if the market gets competitive, the employees will see their wages cut. So the constraint here is, as long as there are employee unions or strong labor markets, employees get decent wages, but once they start to break down, employee wages and benefits also drop off. The sector is now much more open to stronger competition, because now that you're constrained corporatism, you follow the rules. You don't try to make yourself a monopoly, because that might be against the law. But within the rules, you try to get the maximum market share. As far as customers and society are concerned, well, customers will get a package, but it might not be a great package, because to the extent that the constraint is that if there's competition, you can play companies off again, but if competition starts to drop off, then customers are going to feel it. And finally, with society, there is this constraint that if companies are viewed as bad corporate citizens, it costs them. The essence of constrained corporatism is that, first sight, it looks like these constraints cost companies money in terms of losses. But the question is, why do companies adopt these constraints? What drives the constraints? And you can think about 3 possible reasons why companies adopt constraints. One is that the government creates constraints with laws and regulations. And European governments, for instance, have historically created these constraints by putting laws, rules on how how much you pay employees, whether you can lay them off, what social costs there are, how you treat customers. Basically, what the constraints come from the government. That's the first one. And that process works as long as you're in nice, close markets. And one of the reasons that process started to break down, especially with globalization, is you could put all those rules, but if another government did not, you were often competing as a company against another company which had far lower costs than you did and drove you out of the market. So the first potential reason for constraints is governments. The second is these constraints can be self-imposed. Some companies might choose to impose these constraints on themselves. Why? Because they have enough slack in their system. They are making so much money that they can say, look, we're going to pay our employees at least $15 an hour, or we're going to make sure we don't take projects that hurt society. So it's not surprising that the Googles and the Facebooks and the Apples of the world can be so much more generous, so much more willing to do this for stakeholders than GM is. So in a sense, with self-restraint, it comes from the fact that you have slack in the system. There's a third reason these constraints could exist, and this is the best case scenario, at least as far as I'm concerned, in terms of when I think about getting companies to do the right thing. Maybe these constraints exist because what the constraints do actually is that they force companies to do the right thing. In other words, they make your financial interests converge with what's good for society. So here's how it works, which and this may seem like a far reach. So, but if you are, for instance, a company that is a bad corporate citizen that might not even break the laws but pushes to the very edge, then you might either have customers who stop buying your products because they read news stories about you, or worse still, face a catastrophic risk because sooner or later you're going to cross that line, you're going to get into trouble, there's going to be a big news story. So in other words, you're a good corporate citizen not because you want to be, but because it's actually good for value. You actually increase value. You treat customers well. You know why? Because you want them to be repeat customers. So your reason you treat customers well is not because for some reason customers are a stakeholder group you want to keep happy, but because you want to make money off them. You try to actually pay employees higher wages and give them better benefits. Why? Not again because you care about employees as a stakeholder group, but because it brings you better employees and maybe they have more loyalty and you have fewer employee turnover costs. So with each stakeholder group, then the reason you have the constraint is because it actually makes you a more valuable company. In a sense, what constrained corporatism does, that it lets companies go out and maximize shareholder wealth without creating the side costs. Now, if the world work like this, then of course you can stop. But I'm a realist. I know that there are times when markets are not going to do the right thing. They're not going to reward companies for being good corporate citizens. In fact, they might reward companies that are bad corporate citizens. And that's part of what's driving this stakeholder wealth maximization, discussion. And I call this confused corporatism. In confused corporatism, what do you try to do? You try to make everyone happy. So you try to make shareholders good returns. You try to make sure lenders get their interest payments and their principal payments. You make sure employees get a living wage. You make sure that society is taken care of. You make sure customers get a good deal. In other words, if you read what the Business Roundtable had as its statement, you see it. This is confused corporatism. You're trying to keep everybody happy. Now, at one level, as you read this, you're saying, this is great. If companies could do this, then everybody's going to be better off. My caution to you is to give you two counterexamples. One is to remember those government-owned companies. And I'm not just talking about emerging markets where governments own lots of companies. Even in developed markets, especially in Europe, utilities used to be government-owned. And I'd like you to think about how those government-owned companies operated. These were companies where the managers were given a laundry list of objectives. They were told, go out and make sure you don't lose money, but along the way, make sure you create lots of employment, and by the way, make sure you develop the underdeveloped parts of the country in terms of where you put your factories. So I've never envied the CEOs of these companies because they were told to do 10 different things, often in conflict. So the end result was you ended up with some of the most inefficient companies in the face of the earth in terms of having the number of employees they had, the way they were run. Hey, that's what happens when you try to keep a dozen different stakeholder groups happy. No, the other is actually not from the corporate sector, but an entity where I work. I work at a U.S. research university, and I'm not picking on the university that I work at because I think they all share this problem. They have absolutely no idea what the end game is. You walk into university, depending on who you talk to and when, you're going to get a very different answers about what the university is all about, whose interests get served. I mean, it's definitely not those poor undergraduates who pay the bulk of the tuition at these universities. But the end result of universities trying to be all things to all people is they're actually nothing to any of the groups. They're not just economically inefficient, incapable. I mean, they're capable of delivering deficits no matter how much money they raise or how much the tuition is. But you talk to every single stakeholder group at a university, nobody's happy. Students feel they're paying too much and nobody listens to them. Faculty feel that administration, comes in and steps all over their powers. Administrators think faculty are spoiled and will never change. Every single group is unhappy. So what the end result of stakeholder wealth maximization might be is exactly what you observe at these two groupings, which is every stakeholder ends up being unhappy. Nobody's accountable because if you're a CEO of a company which decides that stakeholder wealth maximization is the way to go, CEO essentially used every other group to explain away why one group was not well served. So when shareholders say, "Hey, why are our profits down?" You say, "Well, because I had to take care of the employees in society." When employees say, "Why are our wages down?" Say, social costs this year were bad. It's a way in which accountability becomes almost impossible to trace through in a company. So I know I sound cynical, but my feeling is if you went with stakeholder wealth maximization, you're going to pretty much end up with an end game where none of the stakeholders get what they want. So if you think about why the Business Roundtable did what it did, make this shift in focus, if it was a shift, to stakeholders and all of the things that need to be done, to keep them happy. One way to think about it, maybe it was just a PR move. After all, CEOs are more politicians than business people. And they sense it when, we live in tough times for companies. People are convinced that companies are self-interested entities that don't care about society, that mistreat employees, that really don't care about customers. And politicians have caught on, populists on both sides of the spectrum want companies to change, and CEOs have noticed maybe this statement was a way of saying, look, we care. And if that's the case, then it's just words, nothing will happen. The second, and this is my cynical view, is CEOs have never liked shareholder wealth maximization. Why? Because it makes their life more difficult. To have boards of directors that actually challenge them in annual meetings or ask questions about why they do what they do. Most CEOs prefer to be corporate Caesars, unchallenged, doing whatever they want. And they would love to go back to the managerial corporatism of the 1950s and 60s. And the cynic in me says, look, this might be a diversionary move where while we're focusing on stakeholder wealth maximization, managers essentially recoup their power and put themselves back at the center of the game. And there's a conspiratorial twist, and you got to really be willing to go with conspiracies for this to be true, which is maybe, remember this, the Business Roundtable is composed of CEOs of the largest companies in America. And many of these large companies are being, challenged by young startups, often, disrupting the business. One way to make it really difficult for young companies and new companies to challenge you is by raising the costs of playing the game. So maybe this is a way in which, I told you have to believe in conspiracies, that the larger companies are going to make it so expensive to play the game. Because essentially they're going to try to bring in all these other stakeholder interests that have been met, that they essentially drive the disruptors out of the game. I told you it requires a conspiratorial twist. So whatever the reason, though, I mean, this is now out there, and no, we're going to debate it. But I think that if this is being done to try to fend off the masses, the critics, I don't think it's going to work. I mean, giving up on your fundamental focus on shareholder wealth and replacing it with this ill thought through, perhaps destructive objective of, hey, let's make everybody happy, all the stakeholders happy, is not going to make those critics stop. They're going to find something else to criticize. So it seems to be the wrong way to fight this fight. So you're saying, what should we do? I think I would go back to a full-throated defense of one of the stakeholder groups has to be put up on top, and I think it should be the owners of the company. But I think that we need to think about making that constrained value maximization create better end results for the other stakeholders. And how can we do that? At the minimum, I think we need more transparency with how companies deal with the other stakeholder groups. I'd like to know how much U.S. Steel pays its employees on average, or how much social cost GM creates, or how, essentially with each stakeholder group, I'd like transparency on how the company deals with that stakeholder group and what it does with them. And second, I'd like to start thinking about how to bring in that information that comes from that transparency into value. I think we're moving on both fronts. I think the disclosure requirements on what we'll call fuzzy variables is improving, though it's making annual reports incredibly long. And we're working on figuring out ways in which bringing in the fact that a company is a better corporate citizen into the intrinsic value can be done. So I think that's a much better path. It's a longer term path. It'll require more I think it'll require more work on the part of CEOs, but I think it's better than the stakeholder wealth maximization road they're going down. The end game here is, and I've always believed this, if we want companies to behave better with employees, with customers, with society, we have to make it in their best interest, their financial best interest to do so. In other words, we've all got to be willing to put our mouth where our money where our mouth is, which is, if we care that much about the environment, then we need to start buying goods that are better for the environment, even though they might cost more, and investing in companies that do better for the environment. In other words, if we don't carry through with our actions as consumers and as investors, with all the stuff that we say we care about, companies will not behave better. So ultimately, we want to make companies, do the right thing, not because we've lectured them, but because it's good for their value. We'll see if that happens, but I think that I'm glad, in a sense, I'm glad this debate is now out there in the open. I plan to have it at the start of every one of my corporate finance classes, but I'm not giving up on putting shareholders first, because I think you can't serve a dozen masters. You got to decide who has primacy in this, and what the constraints are. But no, I think it's a debate still worth having. Thank you for listening.